Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Nightlight. Thanks so much for spending your evening with us. We really appreciate it, and hope we can entertain you and enlighten you tonight. We've got a spectacular guest, but first, I want to thank Ken Quiethawk for his amazing introduction. You can find him at nativestorytellers.com. He and his wife are native storytellers, and if you've never experienced native storytelling, you've missed something special. So I would check some out at their website, because it's a part of our history that has not been covered in schools and in many other areas, and it is an amazing way that the first people preserved their history and their genealogies and their spirit and the spirits of those that had gone before, and their philosophies on the cosmology of their beings. So it's an amazing, amazing website. Please check it out. Mark does have an amazing, I seem to be stuck on amazing, has a really interesting guest tonight, and I'm looking so forward to this show because it's on a topic that I actually know a little bit about. So welcome to the show, Mark. You have a great guest here tonight. I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah. We're going to have a lot of fun for the next 2 hours. I think it's going to be another show where people's IQs are going to go up a few more points. It's going to be a good one. But I'm glad to be back for the second time this week.
Yes. Frequent flyer miles.
Yes. And I think we're gonna get into a little bit of everything tonight. A little mini globe-trotting expedition for 2 hours. Not a 3-hour tour, just 2-hour tour. But we're going to be covering Mark Twain, behind-the-scenes look at the Christmas Story House and some paranormal activity in Cleveland. Our special guest is Laura DeMarco. She is the editor of the Arts and Entertainment section of the prestigious Cleveland Plain Dealer. She has a wonderful, just published biography, travelogue of one of America's leading authors, Mark Twain. Her book is entitled Mark Twain's America, Then and Now. It shows photos of the places where Mark Twain was then in 1860s, 70s, and how they look today. There is insightful biographical information that accompanies the couple hundred photos. It's an excellent companion piece to Twain's novels, and I have to thank one of Nightlight's regulars, Mark Eddy, for connecting me to our guest, and it will be worth the $5 I owe him for that, and 10 if he actually has to listen to me on our free archives. But anyhow, Laura DeMarco is here. Hi, Laura. How are you?
Oh, great. Thanks so much for having me. I didn't know Mark got a finder's fee for this. This puts the thing in a whole new light. He cost me a lot of money just dealing with him, but we'll save that for another story. Right.
But Mark's a great guy. He's one of your colleagues too. So, but before you start tackling your Mark Twain's America, let's just get a little background. What prompted you to write this book? What's the need today?
Well, I'll just tell you a little bit about how I came to this book, and then why I think there's a need today. 2 years ago, I wrote a book called Lost Cleveland. I'm a third-generation Clevelander, and it was about lost landmarks, places in the city of Cleveland that are long gone. Amusement parks that have disappeared, whole neighborhoods that are gone, buildings that are gone. It's sort of like about the ghosts of Cleveland. And then, I got tired kind of talking about just things that were gone, so I wrote a second book called Cleveland Then and Now, and that was about transformed places in Cleveland, places that, tell the city's history through their transformation. And Cleveland, your listeners may not know, was once the 5th largest city in America, and it was a really wealthy city. I mean, John D. Rockefeller got his start there. So it's a city with a fabulous history. And those books were both for a company called Pavilion Books, which is a London-based publisher. They mostly do like architectural heritage books, and they do all sorts of things, but their specialty is kind of like about like lost landmarks and, as I said, architectural heritage worldwide. So I was talking with the publisher of those previous 2 books in London. I wasn't in London, although I have been there to meet him. And it just came out that we were like both big Mark Twain fans. Me, a native Clevelander, him, a native Londoner, and we just started talking about Mark Twain. This was just about a year ago. And he said, what would be so interesting was to take this approach that we've done with these other books, where they tell the story through pairing vintage photos with photos of what places look like now. For example, they've done a Civil War battlefield then and now book. And they said they had never applied this approach to a person, but they said, why don't we try this approach with the person? Because Mark Twain, more than anyone else, as you know, he traveled. He was a rambling man. He traveled around the world, and for few writers has such a sense of place or home been so important. So that's how this approach to Mark Twain's biography through the geography of his life came about.
Well, it's a very effective approach, and it just seems like Mike Piper, one of my friends, called me the other day, and he said reminded me that there were some a few chapters from Huckleberry Finn or Tom Sawyer that were recently discovered in Buffalo. So it just seems like there's more information that is just being discovered about this iconic American author.
Yeah, and I think that's because he was, I mean, you could argue that he is the iconic American author. More than anybody, I think he dealt with America as a whole, and the really big issues of America of his day, you know, slavery, racism, what it meant to be a child, you know, what it meant to grow up. He lived everywhere in America. So, I mean, there are so many Mark Twain scholars, and there is, you know, so much to find. You know, Buffalo was a very important city in his life, too. You mentioned Buffalo, and they do have the Huck Finn manuscript in the library there. So, you know, I think every time you read Mark Twain, too, you discover something new as well. I mean, whether it's his fiction or his nonfiction. I think, you know, I think the age that you are when you read it, maybe that helps you discover new things. And just, you know, rereading things, you'll notice things you haven't seen before in those books.
Okay, and you already touched on Mark Twain. It was made travels to Europe. You know, we'll go into that in more detail in a little bit, but let's look at where he was born, where he got his start. It just didn't seem like it's a promising start to someone who would grow up to be an acclaimed author around the world. And technically, where he was born doesn't exist because according to the last census. So that's kind of like a Twain-esque view of where he got started. It's not there anymore.
Right. He was born in a town called Florida, Missouri, November 30th, 1835. So we just celebrated his birthday last week. And Florida, at the time he was born, had 100 people only. This was about 150 miles outside of St. Louis, kind of in the middle of Missouri. His parents, you know, had moved there. He was the sixth child born, and they were living in basically a one-room cabin, white cabin. And he would later say, you know, he's born one person into a town of 100, that he did something that many of the greatest men in history hadn't done. He had increased the population, you know, of a city by 1%, you know, which is quite a feat, of course. And they moved out of there by the 1840s, and then they weren't the only ones. The population of Florida declined pretty quickly from those 100 or so people. And today it is, in fact, a ghost town. There's no recorded residents of Florida, Missouri. His cabin, or what is believed to be the Clemens, obviously his name was Samuel Clemens, the Clemens cabin has been preserved as a museum heritage piece. So then in the 1840s, they moved to the most famous town associated with Mark Twain, Hannibal, Missouri, of course. Not too far from Florida, but right on the Mississippi River, and that was a big bustling town for the time. You know, it had logging and you know, farming, and a lot of pigs were raised there. So they moved there because his father, J.M. Clemens, who was a justice of the peace and did all sorts of things, he was sort of jack of all trades, wanted to move there. He felt he could be more prosperous there for his family.
Okay, and when the Clemens family got to Hannibal, it does like a frontier river town at that time. Just seem like, you know, people were just like living on the periphery of civilization. You know, a lot of the contemporary photos look like people, you know, were almost living in squalor. You got the just streets were dirt and mud, and houses looked like they were falling down. If the Mississippi River flooded, it looks like it is, you know, relatively flat in the area, so the water's just going to keep going. It just your photos really bring to life what it was like at that time, but you also have contemporary photos of the neighbors, people, not up the street, who Sam knew, and they would become characters 40 years later in his more celebrated novels. Can you tell us a little bit about what the city of Hannibal has done to preserve the Twain legacy in the town?
Yeah, so you mentioned, to go back to his time first, you mentioned that it was kind of a rough and tumble town, a frontier town, and yet it was also, at that point, a town of possibilities, right? I mean, people were moving west and further away from the East Coast to kind of pursue what really was the American dream. So, I mean, this was a place where people could pursue those dreams. His father's never worked out too well, as his older brother Orion's did not. Samuel Clemens obviously was the most successful person in his family, but so he lived in a house on Hill Street, on and off. I mean, they lost the house at some point, but he and his siblings and parents mostly lived there, and his had the street, and his brother opened up a newspaper in the town, Orion. And so this, all kind of forms him. But what also forms him, as you mentioned, is the people of Hannibal. His next door neighbor basically was Tom Blankenship. Tom was the son of the town drunk. He was very poor, kind of a wild boy. He didn't go to school. His parents couldn't afford for him to go to school. He ran the streets. And Tom would later become the basis for Huckleberry Finn. Across the street, there was a girl who would become the basis for Becky Thatcher. So he's meeting all these people in this town that really define for him the idyllic American childhood and become characters in his book. So, I mean, you really can't underestimate the importance of Hannibal in his life for both, just the possibilities it showed him as a town and the place for his family, and also just for the people he met there. And they stuck with him forever. But in 1902, he went back to visit, and it was one of the most poignant moments of his life to see, the people had obviously aged quite a lot, as had he, and just to see how the town, had changed as well. So, but you asked about what the town is doing today for this. I visited Hannibal just about a year ago as I was researching this book. And it is all about Mark Twain. I mean, you have a 7-building museum, which includes the Boyhood Home, the Becky Thatcher Home, a reconstruction of the Tom Blankenship Home, a really wonderful museum that recreates the experience of what it was like to be a steamboat pilot. So you have all this. And then you have the ancillary things. You have the Mark Twain Brewery. You have the Mark Twain Water Park. You have the candy shops named after, Mrs. Clemens candy shops. I mean, everybody there is all about Mark Twain. We stayed just at a Comfort Inn, or I don't even know, something like that, like Comfort Inn on the outside of town, and over the check-in desk is like a painting of Mark Twain. So, I mean, Hannibal is all about Mark Twain. They do big conferences there every year, bringing in scholars. So it's really, it's sort of become the main business of Hannibal, in fact, as scholars, scholarly interest.
And you said the 1902 visit was a very poignant moment in Sam's life, and that's the cover, or the photo on the cover of your book. Is
Yes.
Okay, got that. The right visit there. Okay, so he's what's about 70.
He was born in 35, so yeah, he's almost 70.
Okay,
and he, so I mean, even as I'm not as old as that, and I get melancholic looking back at my childhood. So imagine being, Mark Twain and looking back at this place that formed him so vibrantly, and he knew, that it would be his last visit. I was talking with somebody about this the other day. Like, despite all this, he was very savvy, right, Mark Twain, or Sam Clemens, whatever you want to call him. And so he didn't go there alone. He stopped to bring a newspaper reporter from St. Louis along with him, and the press knew where he was. Outside of the frame of that photo on the cover, there's a gaggle of people, reporters and villagers and everything wanting to talk to him. But he probably knew that this was the last time he would ever see this place that was so important to him.
Okay, and that house is also part of the Twain
it's the
National
main part
Park.
Of the house.
Okay.
The house is the part of the
That's the Hill
Boyhood Museum.
Yeah, the Hill Street. Okay, that one.
Yeah, so that house, which was his childhood home, it's his actual home. It's not a reconstruction. That was that is like the main sort of thing when you go to the museum. There is you get to go into the house.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's so. When the 1902 photo is on page 12. Okay. The today's photos on the next page, and you're taking the photo basically in the same spot as the 1902 photo was taken.
Yeah, so that's the premise with the book, is to try to show the exact same spot, even from the same angle and time of day, as much as possible, to really give the reader a sense of what had been there before and how it must have looked at that time. And there's another picture of it later in the book. So there's an early picture and then there's a later picture in it. And that later one you could actually see, it's on page 128. You can see like the photographers all there standing around him to get a picture of, the famous author at his modest childhood home.
Right there. Yep, there it is. Yeah, and you do mention the characters in the neighborhood that would go on to inspire Becky Thatcher, but there was still aside from the like fun activities with the neighborhood kids, there was like almost like an creepy undercurrent that seemed to have an impact on it. It seemed like it almost created a little bit of post-traumatic stress disorder. Like for example, he tripped over a body in his dad's office, and you do cover a little bit about it. There was, use your word, a loss of innocence.
Absolutely. And there was a body in his office, and he was at night, and he fell over a dead body. Can you imagine that? You're a kid. Even more upsettingly, there were slaves in Missouri in his childhood, as well as, escaped slaves coming through, heading north. And one of the most terrible moments of his childhood was seeing a body of a slave, on the and then as well. It's a really, really dark side of life. I mean, he saw murder in the streets one day too. So you're very to say it wasn't just the idyllic childhood. It was also saw a really dark side of human nature and of America, all in that one little town.
Mm-hmm. And when Vinny Kocius co-hosted with me earlier this year, and we were talking with Chris Sumner from the Poe Museum, and we got into talking a little bit about how traumatic events help to shape the creative process. Was some of these like the unfortunate events you saw with slaves and the body in his dad's office, is there an aspect of that childhood trauma that seems to follow him throughout his mature writings?
I think so. I mean, it's certainly very much plays idea of the young poor white boy Huck Finn trying to do what he thought was moral at the time and trying to figure out what that was to help an escaped slave or not. I mean, and that was that's probably the most obvious lesson that he learned in this town. But I mean, Mark Twain was a very he was born a poor Southerner with a family that had people in his family had slaves, and he saw this, and he died a very enlightened man. I mean, he was a very progressive thinker, and you have to think that a lot of this came about because of things he saw in his childhood. I mean, he was a anti-imperialist. He was he supported women's rights. He was an abolitionist. He was a anti-vivisectionist. So he was these are things that you fiction writing as well as his fiction writing.
Okay, after getting up to about in his later teens, he has his first job in printing. He was working for his brother. Eventually goes to St. Louis. Okay, so we're spend a little bit of time talking about the experiences that are shaping him, and now he's getting his foot in the door with his first job, working in publishing. How'd that go?
I think she's taking a short break, so hopefully she'll be calling back in.
Oh, okay.
Possibly she's switching phones, or she, as so often happens when you get involved in something like this, you forget that your battery needs to be charged and stuff like that. You're talking about an author that I adore, and as I told you earlier, I don't live too far from his house in Hartford, and I did a psychic investigation there with a group of people, and it was fabulous to be able to walk around the rooms that Mark Twain walked in, and he lived right next door to Harriet Beecher Stowe, And so, I didn't go over and walk through her house, but it's certainly it's like you can actually touch history and be a part of history and absorb some of the energy that came from it. It was really quite profound. So it was a very exciting time, and of course we didn't get any ghosts or anything, but it was still exciting. And we had our EVPs, and we were saying if anybody's there, we'd like to talk to you, and all sorts of stuff like that. And of course nobody wanted to talk to us, which was kind of very sad. But his house was phenomenal. I think she's back. You back again?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Hi.
Yep.
Yeah.
Hi, you lost me about 5 minutes ago, I think.
Yeah, I was going to suggest you call in on your other phone because you were fading in and out on the phone you were on.
Oh, okay.
Is that
how is it now? I can do that. Yeah, I can call back on the other phone. Just a second.
Okay.
Okay. So, yeah, every time I've tried to stop at the Twain house, it's like 3 a.m. And
well,
not.
It's a huge house. I mean, for the time, and it's on a very majestic street setting, and the property and everything. It's really quite. It's. I would say it's close to a mansion, or what I would have called a mansion during that day, and they have a museum attached to the house, which is quite fascinating. I think she's back again. Hi, back again?
Hello?
Okay.
Okay.
I tried a different
good.
phone. Yeah, this sounds better to me now.
Okay.
So I heard you were talking about Hartford.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I'm very close to it.
Okay.
Yeah. So, do you? I think we have a little bit of ground to cover before we get to Hartford, but Sam gets his first job being a typesetter, working for his brother. He's kind of making a little bit of a name for himself, and he eventually starts making his way towards the East Coast.
Right.
He has some experience under his belt. Okay, what's going on with his New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. experiences? How does that shape him?
Yeah, so by the time he was 18, little Hannibal just wasn't enough for Sam Clemens anymore. And unbeknownst to his brother, who owned the newspaper, Orion, he put an ad in the paper for his own replacement. Then he left. He headed to St. Louis, where he had a sister living, and he stayed with her a little. And he was just blown away by St. Louis when he got there. He thought it was this amazing city, but he didn't even stay in St. Louis very long. As I mentioned earlier, Mark Twain always had this desire to travel and move. He couldn't sit still, and in fact, he told his mom in one letter from around this time period, "I'm wild with impatience to move." So he just keeps moving. So he thinks St. Louis is impressive. Well, the next city he visited was, just about the most impressive one in America at the time. It was New York City, where he ends up in 1853. And his family realized he had moved to New York because he sent a letter home to them. And while he was there, he again found work as a typesetter in New York. And when he wasn't working, he just explored the city. And at this point in time, New York is a big city, but nothing, like what it is now. But it's one of the biggest ones in America. And it had nearly 600,000 people at that time. So that was, from being born in a town of 100, this is pretty amazing. So when he's not working, he's just walking around everywhere, walking by the docks, walking around the city, spent a lot of times in theaters and saloons and so on. And the one thing that really blew him away was the Crystal Palace exhibition that was there in 1853. So he went to see that. He was blown away by that. But again, he wants to keep moving. So he heads not far away next to Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, he finds the same type of work. 2 was a typesetter. And again, he spends his time, his off work time is almost more important because he's getting out and he's seeing the world and he's seeing different types of people and he's seeing, some of America's most amazing sights at the time, which included, of course, in Philadelphia, the famous sites of American patriots and so many things from American history that were there. And then also, he saw the Liberty Bell, of course. He saw Ben Franklin's grave, and he saw the Fairmount Waterworks, which is this kind of architectural wonder of the time. So he's in Philadelphia, and he just, even there, he's just not fulfilled. He keeps traveling, and his next city was one that he would become very familiar with throughout his life, and that's Washington, D.C. By 1854, he goes there. He doesn't stay long in any place. He makes some money and gets to see the city a little. And in all these sections of the book, there are the then and now photos, as we discussed. So he goes to Washington, D.C., and he sees, the sites that are being worked on at the time. And he never liked Washington, D.C. or politicians much in his life, but he was pretty blown away by the first time he saw it. And then he decides to head sort of closer back to home in 1855 because Orion had moved to a town called Keokuk, Iowa, and was working at a paper there. And he decided to go back and take a job with Orion in his newspaper there in Iowa.
Okay, and just to back up for a second, when Sam is in Washington, D.C., he got very interested in the Museum of the Patent Office.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to work in Edison and Tesla later, but I didn't realize until when I read your book, like how really intrigued he was by all these new inventions and gadgets, and he's right there in the America's Victorian era, seeing all these inventions happening. He's really intrigued by the telephone.
Oh yeah. He was intrigued his whole life by technology, like you say. The character Hank in A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. I mean, that was sort of inspired by his Mark Twain's love of technology. He had to be the first one in his neighborhood in Hartford to have a telephone, and he wanted electricity early. But in Washington, it was sort of his love of both technology and typesetting and newspapering that merged, because he really what he really was fascinated with at the Museum of the Patent Office was Benjamin Franklin's a printing press used by Benjamin Franklin in London. So it was a little bit of something very close to the life he had experienced that far. And of course, printing presses and typesetting, it got him into writing, and it was very important throughout his whole life because, as I write about in the book, and then most Mark Twain fans will know, that he lost most of his fortune later in his life, and a large part of that was because he invested in something called the Page typesetter, which was supposed to be the best typesetting machine ever, but it was kind of a flop. Samuel Clemens was never a good businessman, but he was so fascinated by this typesetting machine, that he almost became bankrupt later in his life.
Okay. Well, we're going to return to that subject, but you're just wetting our whistle for
right.
some really neater things in the 1890s that he's going to experience. But okay, so Sam has some of these getting a foundation for creating his legacy, 20, 30 years down the road. But so he eventually gets back, to the Midwest, and that's when he gets involved with the river boats.
Right.
How does that happen? Where he's back in his kind of like native area. How does that career develop?
Well, he so as I mentioned, after Washington, he goes back to Iowa, where Orion is, and he's working there for him. And it's here where he, there's always a little bit of like fictionalizing going on with Mark Twain, even as far as own life goes. But so the story goes is that one night he's walking down a snowy street in Iowa, and he finds $50, which of course is a fortune in 1855. And he decides that he's going to, take this money, and he is going to go to the Amazon and become a cocoa farmer. He had heard that these plants possessed miraculous powers. But first, he needs to make a little more money, so he decides to go to Cincinnati, of all places, for a couple of reasons. There was a big printing industry there, so he knew he could get a job. And it was a town, although it is in Ohio, has more of a southern feel. It's right on the river, the Ohio River. So he decides to go to Cincinnati for a while. This is one of the least documented times of his life. He wrote some letters that were published from here and so on, but he never really talks too much about Cincinnati. Certainly not favorably. I don't know if you've ever heard the saying that he said, when the end of the world comes, I would like to be in Cincinnati because they're always 20 years behind the times. I find that very funny because I have a lot of family in Cincinnati, but that's probably apocryphal. That's probably not something he said, but he didn't really like Cincinnati much. You can figure that out from some other things that he wrote. So anyway, he's in Cincinnati, and he finally decides he has enough money. He's going to go to New Orleans, and he's going to catch a boat down to the Amazon, and he's going to become a cocoa farmer, which of course means, since he wants to import cocoa plants back to America, that he wants to become basically like a cocaine drug dealer. I mean, he didn't know this at the time, but that's, in practicality, that's what that would have been. Mark Twain, like Scarface drug lord. But anyway, he goes down to he takes the boat. They didn't know these things. He just knew that it had miraculous powers. So he takes a river boat from Cincinnati. Pardon?
Freud thought that too.
He did, yeah. But he knew a little bit more about what he was doing. I think Sam Clemens was actually pretty naive about it at the time. So he takes the boat, down to all the way to New Orleans. And when he gets to New Orleans, he realizes, in fact, no boats go down to the Amazon from there, and they haven't for years. He hadn't thought there's no way for him to get to the Amazon. But fortunately, he already had another idea. He was never short of ideas. On this boat, the Paul Jones, he had become friendly with the pilot, a man named Horace Bixby, and he really loved riding on the riverboat. I mean, he grew up, a block away from the great Mississippi, so he just loved this. And he convinced Horace Bixby to take him on as a cub pilot. So that's the next years of his life, for learning to become a Mississippi riverboat pilot, and then he gets his pilot's license. And this is probably the first really transformative time of his life, because he's come into his own, as a man, and a man who's seeing the world again, but for his job. He's going up and down the rivers, Vicksburg, Memphis, of course, New Orleans, so all around. He's pretty well off. The pilots, even the Cubs, were paid, fairly well. And certainly once he got his license, he was very well paid. He liked to indulge some of the high life in New Orleans, in fact. So he's really seeing the world, and so much of his adventures from this time are, of course, written about in, life on the Mississippi and then in old times on the Mississippi. too. So, we know like a lot about his experiences at this time because of this. So he probably could have stayed a riverboat or, steamboat pilot his whole life, except in 1861, the Civil War comes and he is stopped by a blockade outside of the city, and that puts an end to his riverboat career.
The life of the river, would still never leave him after, and that was actually a prestigious job at that time.
Oh, it was, yes.
And okay, so now, Mark, the Civil War ends. That phase of his life. He heads out west, and that became a really fascinating section of your book. With all your photos, and it sounds like one of the culmination of his trip out west was going to having a job at a San Francisco newspaper, and he got sent to Hawaii. That really seemed to be at a time when most people probably didn't leave home for more than 20 miles.
I know.
He's already been to all up good portion of the eastern seaboard, and now he's going to Hawaii. That was a really formative experience. Can you tell us a little bit about the ship, the shipwreck and all?
Yeah, sure. So the reason he went out west was because his brother Orion had been appointed governor, by President Lincoln. He had worked for President Lincoln, and so he had been appointed, to a government position in the Nevada Territory. Well, Sam didn't have anything to do, so he decides to tag along to be his unofficial secretary. When he got there, he realized there wasn't really much to do in this job, didn't pay anything. So a lot of this is written about in his book Roughing It years later. So he tries his hand at a lot of things. He tries to be a prospector, because this was during the gold rush, of course, on one of the Comstock lode. He didn't do too well at that. He almost caused a massive forest fire by Lake Tahoe when he was trying to become a logger. So he's trying to figure out what to do, and then he finds, basically he strikes gold, but not in the way that he had hoped, in a city called Virginia City, because he gets a job there finally as a newspaper reporter, not just a typesetter or anything. And he starts to make his name as a writer. And then he, ends up sort of pretty eventful, but eventually he makes his way to San Francisco. He's doing some writing there. That's the only time in his life he was actually fired from a job. He was fired from the newspaper in San Francisco. So if you ever feel bad about losing a job or something, just remember Mark Twain was actually fired from a writing job. So he, heads, to a place called Angel Falls, California, where he hears this great story about a jumping frog, and he writes that up. And so that sort of becomes one of his most famous short stories. And eventually this all leads him to a really, really great writing assignment, one that, any writer today would probably go for. He gets to just go over to Hawaii, which was called the Sandwich Islands at that time, for 4 months, just to experience the culture and write about it and tell the rest of America what this exotic island area is like. So he takes this job. The reason they were sending a writer there is because you could finally make it from California to the Sandwich Islands in 3 weeks, which was a impressive feat. So he goes there and he just has a great time. As I said, he was there for 4 months, and there he does things like he eats poi, which he really hated. He tries to learn to surf. He likes to go skinny dipping with like the native people, and they really weren't too happy about that, especially the women. She's really soaking up the culture, seeing the volcanoes and so on. And he's sending back letters, and reports. And then one day in Honolulu, towards the end of his stay, the survivors of a terrible shipwreck of a ship called the Hornet, a clipper ship, wash up on shore. Of course, he's the only newspaper reporter, there from the mainland, and he interviews these survivors. And this becomes a sensation across America. And really, the Jumping Frog kind of put him on the map, but this really puts him on the sort of like writing map of continental America in a pretty big way. And this is 1866.
Okay, and you have some great photos of the Honolulu harbor, the contemporary with Twain's visit in the 1860s and what it looks like today. Other than the mountains in the background, that hasn't changed, but the harbor really has, and that's like really a dramatic standout in your book.
Oh yeah.
Of what things were like 150 years ago and now.
Yeah, I mean, it really was a different world at that time, especially there. I mean,
right.
It was so different. I can't imagine what it like, to have just been an American living, in I don't know, Philadelphia or New York or Hannibal. There must have been something that was just so exotic. I mean, even today it's exotic, right? I'm a Clevelander, and I went to Hawaii once, and I was like, oh my God, this is the most amazing, beautiful, interesting place I've ever seen.
Okay, but it was actually this experience of the survivors washing ashore, and Sam's writing sending the reports back to San Francisco. Right. That actually is kind of getting him started on his lecture circuit. Lecture cert, and that would maybe a lot of people don't realize that he didn't become very wealthy just from the publication of Huckleberry Finn and success of other books. He was actually a very well respected speaker.
Yeah, before he was a famous writer, he was a very famous speaker. I mean, after his mentor, Artemus Ward, maybe, the most famous sort of literary speaker. So, yes, you're right. His Sandwich Islands lecture, which he started delivering on the West Coast, really became a sensation. And this is what drives him back to the East Coast, the center of literary America again, the chance to deliver this Sandwich Islands lecture out there at places, like the Cooper Institute. So he's really becoming a sought-after name. And he was always really worried about these early lectures, but they usually did very well. But he would do things like, give away free tickets, like plant people who would be guaranteed to applause, in the audience and so on. But, this really sort of spreads, his reputation. It keeps growing and growing thanks to these lectures.
Yeah, and so by the time he wraps up everything on the West Coast, he heads back east, and he's on the lecture circuit in New England, and he starts. He tells us that he's becomes friends with Reverend Beecher.
Yes.
That leads to a trip to the Holy Land.
Mm-hmm.
But the nice thing about your book, Mark Twain's America, is that you're giving us all these photos of where Reverend Beecher's church was located, and it's still there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Pilgrim Congregational Church. Plymouth Congregational Church.
Yep, and it's on page 66. But it's through the lecture circuit that Sam's making a name for himself, and Dickens was doing the same thing.
Yeah.
About the same time. Dickens would pass away in just a couple years from this late 1860s time period. But it's when Sam meets Reverend Beecher, there's kind of foreshadows all these other very prominent politicians and entertainers. And, we'll get to that, but it's really astounding how you demonstrated how Sam has gone from really very humble beginnings to all these experiences really shaping him for the person we know today, or we kind of know, but he's misunderstood in some circles, but he's this. You do a terrific job explaining all this. I just really did not know that much about Twain, Twain's career.
Well, thank you. I mean, it was really fascinating to dig into the, his story through these places and sort of look up, for example, like the history of Plymouth Congregational Church, Reverend Beecher's church, and so on. And one way I did a lot of the research was looking through old newspaper articles of the time, like reviews of his lectures and advertisements for the Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain lectures, and that really sort of gave a sense of how he was growing in popularity with these lectures. Like I found an old ad, it was from his first appearance in Cleveland, 1868, so not long after this time period we're talking about, where it said, everybody is going rich and poor, and so on. And it was a really big deal, like very early in his lecture career when Mark Twain was coming to town. I mean, that was the hot ticket.
Barbara, we'll have to do that with Nightlight. Take that, do a road show.
Yeah,
right.
Take that advertisement. I could actually send you one or two of the ads to look at.
Cool.
It's pretty funny just to see all the, exclamation points and the highfalutin language that they use. But it really does give you a sense of it was like he was sort of the rock star of his day, from very early on. I mean, this was the hot ticket in town, and years later when he came back to America after having been abroad for the good part of a decade, I said something in the book, like, it wasn't again until the Beatles came to New York in 1964 that there was so much excitement. I mean, there was like 1,000 people in the New York Harbor for him to arrive. He was like a genuine, rock star before there was such a thing.
Yeah, but that was really the only form of entertainment.
Exactly. Yeah.
And,
probably Charles Dickens was obviously a little bit big, maybe a little bit bigger. In fact, he on what is probably could be described as his first date with his future wife, Livy, they went to see Charles Dickens on New Year's Eve in New York City. But that was like a big deal. Her family had gotten tickets to Charles Dickens. They were a very wealthy family. But yeah, I mean, reading at home or going out to see lectures, if you were in a city and you were lucky enough to have an exciting speaker coming to your town, that was what you did.
Yeah, and if you lived in a major city, like Philadelphia, you had the Peel Museum, or parts of it, it's survived, and you had the Barnum Museum, but the circus would come later, but there
Right.
really wasn't a whole lot of entertainment at that time, and what Sam must have been a really captivating speaker to be able to, like 1,500 seat auditoriums.
Oh yeah, and there were times when he was playing to 4,000, seats places. So yeah, I mean, to imagine that, just entertaining with your, there's no props or anything. There's just you telling your stories.
Yeah, and okay. So Sam makes a lot of money. He has a few successful books under his belt, and he moves up the street from Barbara in Hartford. So this your photos of the Hartford house, that's still standing.
Yeah.
The Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship group. We helped to promote back in September. They held their annual conference at the Twain Hartford house. Was it second week of October? So we have a little experience dealing with this historic house, but you also have many photos of just how elaborate it is. Pool table. It's like they spared no expense in building this dream house.
No, they didn't. And the dream house is a great way to put it because, we were talking about Sam's home in Hannibal before, like how important that was in his formation. Like home was very important to him. He loved to travel, but to have a home to come back to is really very important. It grounded him. And so that, Hannibal was his childhood home. And this was the home where he raised his family, the house in Hartford. And by the time he built it, he was a very successful author at that point. And also his wife had come into a large inheritance. She was a wealthy woman. And they spared no expense. I mean, he was a great thinker and writer, but he was also a real, bon vivant, and he loved to enjoy life. There was gorgeous parlors, and they were known for their entertaining. You know, they had these big public spaces. And not only did they spare no expense when they built it, about 5 years later, they had Louis Comfort Tiffany come in and basically completely redecorate everything because they had never really been happy with the decorations. So, you know, that was certainly not a major contributor, but it was a contributor to his financial problems, just the amount of money that he, you know, spent on things like that. I mean, as I mentioned, they were legendary for their parties. We're getting close to Christmas now. They were really well known for their Christmas parties. He loved Christmas. He would dress up as Santa. He would write, really detailed letters to his 3 daughters. He had 4 children. 3 survived to adulthood. His son died an infant. And he would write these letters to his daughters, he would say many, many times later that the time in Hartford was the happiest time in his life when his daughters were young. He was a successful writer. He was just he lived a great life there, and he was family was so important to him, and this is where his family was the happiest. And one of my favorite pictures in the book are of him and his daughters with the dog just kind of hanging out there, and you can just get a sense of. I mean, there obviously later in life there was friction between some of the girls and him, but you can just get a sense of what love he had for his children.
And one of the interesting points is about 10 years after writing the Gilded Age.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like becoming the same thing. He was satirized in like one of his first novels, but he also used his wealth to benefit a lot of other people, and you have the sample of Warner McGuinn,
right?
From the Yale. Can you tell us a little bit about?
Yeah, so he was very he wasn't showy about it, but he was very very generous and philanthropic, and in kind of like unusual ways for his time. As I mentioned, he grew up in a time in the South when slavery was still around. So he saw the terrible way that blacks were treated in America. And later in his life, he figured pretty prominently in the role of a man who became a very prominent African American attorney. He met him when he went to Yale. His name was Warner McGuinn, and he was a brilliant student there. And so Samuel Clemens was going there to give a talk, and he was the one who was taking him around and, sort of showing him the school and so on. And he was so impressed by Warner McGuinn because not only was he a great student and very active in the student body, he was working several jobs to put his way through college at the time. He was one of the first black students there, and he was just so impressed by him and sort of touched by the fact he was working as a waiter, a hat checker, a bill collector, doing all this stuff, that he went to unbeknownst to Mr. McGuinn, he went to the school, the dean of the law school, and said he would like to pay his tuition as well as his living expenses for the rest of his college career. And I think that what he wrote to the dean is really it's worth reading. He said, "I do not believe I would have very cheerfully help a white student who would ask a benevolence of a stranger, but I do not feel so about the other color. We have ground the manhood out of them, and the shame is ours, not theirs, and we should pay for it." I mean, that's something that is so relevant to even, in 2019 America, this idea of this white man feeling that he was complicit, in the way that this African American had been treated, and trying to make reparations for that. And but he wasn't the only person he helped. He helped Helen Keller. A lot of people don't know that, the famous blind, deaf, and dumb American girl. He was very charitable. He helped many many people over the years, even when he himself was, from all outward appearances, he was doing well, but he wasn't necessarily financially doing well all those years.
But with the wealthy celebrity status he had, living in a exclusive neighborhood in a prominent East Coast town like Hartford, it gave him access to many other leading celebrities
right.
of the time period. And earlier in the show, we were talking about Sam's interest in gadgets and technology, and where's the page where you have the couple photos of Sam in Tesla's lab. Like Barbara's had Tim Swartz. There it is on page 118. Tim Swartz was on talking about his book on Tesla, but I think a lot of people may not realize that, and I think a lot of late night radio listeners are probably more intrigued by and inspired by Tesla than Edison.
Yeah, there's certainly been a rise in interest in Tesla in the last few years too. I think he was his sort of genius was not appreciated as it should be. He came up, with the alternating current. He was like a real character too. I mean, he did so many things. He was a genius in so many ways. But he lived in New York, and he met Mark Twain, through New York, and Mark Twain was fascinated with what he was doing, and would go over to his laboratory, which tragically burned down, taking years worth of notes and work with it. At one point, Mark Twain liked Edison too. Obviously, Tesla and Edison is a very famous and bitter rivalry between the two. But I chose to feature his relationship with Tesla in the book. There's some great pictures of him in the laboratory. He actually sought out medical help from Tesla. At one point, he thought he would help him with his stomach ailments if he had the kind of currents run through him. Kind of hard to describe. But basically, sort of all it made him do is he really had to go to the bathroom very badly. So he said a couple of weeks later, oh, actually, I do feel better. So.
Okay. Yeah.
He was thinking outside the box.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's kind of backfired, but
yeah,
it does sound like that. Yeah, trying that, outside the box thinking, is typical of Mark Twain. But there's I've done another show where what prompted intrigued me about this section of your book. This is 1894, and I did another show 4 or 5 years ago about L. Frank Baum and the Reign of the Wizard of Oz, and Tesla was at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, so that's only a year prior to these photos being taken, and Tesla had his displays going on for the length of the fair, and L. Frank Baum, the author of the Wizard of Oz series, was also at that fair in Chicago. I've always just been intrigued by that event. Are you aware of any connection between Tesla and Baum, or see anything about Frank getting some ideas for some of the sci-fi type imagery used in the Wizard of Oz series? That's a little side, personal interest thing.
Actually, I don't know anything about that. That's very interesting.
It's just like within this 1893, 1894 time period, you have two very prominent authors having like some kind of connection to Tesla. I'm just throwing that out there. I'm just intrigued by it.
I don't know. Actually, my husband is Serbian American, like Nikola Tesla, and he's hugely popular in the Serbian community. And there's actually a museum to him in Belgrade, which a lot of our friends have gone to. So maybe I'll ask around a little bit. Maybe they've seen something about that in the museum.
Yeah, call them up. We still have a little bit more time left.
Yeah.
But I was just that's just like a little personal interest. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but it's really very intriguing, and I don't know. There's
I mean, Nikola Tesla is such a fascinating character, and that time frame is just so so interesting. I don't know, about the L. Frank Baum thing, but he was certainly very interested in technology and things like that. So maybe.
There's someone's doctoral thesis idea form.
I'm sure maybe somebody already has done it. We'll just have to dig around.
Yeah. But okay, so we have Twain at the height of his career. He goes. You touched on the bankruptcy earlier, but he did manage to pull himself out of that situation. How did he do that?
Well, he did that in a couple of ways. He had one man who became one of the most important friends in his later years, H.H. Rogers, who was from Standard Oil, became his sort of main financial advisor and really helped him get out of a lot of bad situations because he had lost money through his publishing company, Charles Webster, through the Page typesetter, and then just through, basically overspending. And H.H. Rogers kind of got his affairs in order, but in helped him, really importantly, probably the most important thing he did is helped him retain the copyright on all of his writing. But Sam was bankrupt, and he needed to still make this money back. So this is such a weird thing to think about these days. So the family decided to move to Europe because it was much cheaper to live in Europe than it was in America. So they traveled around Europe for the good better part of a decade. I mean, he would make many trips back to do book tours and to deal with business, but for the most part, his family lived in Europe for the 1890s because that was much more affordable. So that saved money, and just by he had really, he was older then. He had gout and he wasn't feeling that well, but he had not wanted to go back on the lecture tour circuit. But he realized that was really the only thing he could do. He knew he could make a lot of money by doing that. And in fact, he did. He toured the whole world, in the 1890s, giving speeches, from Australia through Europe and everywhere around America and Canada. And he made his money. He made back his money. He became a wealthy man again, paid off all his debts. And as I said, he kept his copyright, so he was able to keep making money on the books as well at that time.
And around this, these difficult times, a little bit before it, but in the late 1880s, 1890s, he publishes Huck Finn, but he's also getting started with his own publishing company, and that company published Huck Finn, and then their second book that they were getting out was the memoirs of President Grant.
Right.
And a lot of people may not realize that there was such a personal connection between those two. Great friends, and Twain was there to help General Grant through this his death. Can you tell us a little bit about that friendship?
Yeah, so he had met U.S. Grant a couple of times over the years, and Ulysses S. Grant was a giant in American history, right? I mean,
right.
So important what he did for the Union, and he decided he wanted to write his memoirs. Coincidentally, he was dying of cancer at the same time, and Mark Twain thought he was getting a bad deal with the person who had offered to publish it. So he said he would publish it. And this, in fact, was by far the most successful book he published, because these books were sold door to door to American veterans and men. And just think about it. Every man in America was touched by the Civil War, and women too. I mean, but the men were the soldiers. The women were the ones who, did everything else in that time period. So this book was sold door to door across America. So probably just about everyone in America wanted a copy. It was a huge bestseller when it did finally come out, right at the time that U.S. Grant actually ended up dying. But he completed the book. Charles Webster, which was Mark Twain's company, published it, and he gave him an extremely fair deal, more royalties than anybody else would have done. And in fact, when he died, he made sure that his wife got was really very well taken care of and got all of her royalties. He wrote, an enormous check to her because, they were friends more than anything. They were friends. Mark Twain had spoken at a dinner for him in Chicago at a big, Grand Army of the Republic celebration. So this was, a book that he felt should come out. And the idea of that some publisher would kind of try to rip off, Ulysses S. Grant really was very wrong to him. And he personally didn't profit hugely off of this. He did this so that U.S. Grant, who was dying, could have something for his family, because he, like Mark Twain, he also had been a very bad businessman and lost a lot of his fortune.
That was, you just have a feeling that those two were really mismatched. Twain was more of a Southerner.
Right.
Twain hated politics and was disgusted by being in Washington, but he was able to put aside differences, and he was really close friends with President Grant. It's really a neat story.
Yeah, I think you actually saw him as an honest politician. I mean, it's weird to think about, because Grant's administration was, kind of plagued with issues and corruption, not of his doing, but in his administration. He was much better, probably, fighter, and he's a much better leader of men in the battlefield than he was, of politicians in Washington, D.C. But I think Mark Twain thought of him, though, as an honest, personally a very honest, upright, moral person who made big sacrifices and who was really loved by his men, the men who fought for him. And I also wonder, too, because, sort of the most problematic time of Mark Twain's life, I think, is during the Civil War, because he fled. I mean, he didn't choose sides. I mean, thankfully, he didn't choose, to fight in the cause of slavery or the Confederacy like many Missourians did. But he didn't join the Union either. He took kind of the easy way out. He fled to the West Coast with his brother, who was clearly a supporter of President Lincoln. And when you think about that, sort of him fleeing, and it's a little bit, like I said, a little bit, problematic to think about. So I often kind of wonder if maybe this in some way was his kind of making amends for his own sort of lack of really taking a role during the Civil War.
Okay. That makes sense.
I mean, it's just purely, speculation. But I often wondered later, because he was, as we were talking about a little bit earlier, such a progressive thinker. But he probably would have been a terrible soldier. He did have about a 24-hour, a very brief foray into fighting in a militia in Hannibal, and it ended almost in a comedically bad way. So he probably wouldn't have been a good fighter either.
Okay, at least he wasn't killed, and
yeah, exactly.
We have his
like so many other
legacy.
American men were on either side.
Yes.
Such a incredible tragedy.
And, but we're kind of winding things down here, but there are still many homes left to visit. We've talked about the Hartford one. There is the Twain family grave site, the study, some of the other, the Hudson Valley, Wave Hill house. Those are still standing structures. You're obviously the boyhood home is still there, but when you're going to photograph all these places, so some are open to the public. What about some of the other ones, or do you have to get permission to photograph the house?
Well, fortunately, I did not take the pictures. I wrote the text, and I helped find the vintage pictures. but professional
Oh.
photographers took the picture, so it looks much better than if I had done it. So what happened was the publisher sort of worked with photographers in each city to, because there's so many places, there's 69 places, so they worked with photographers in each city to take those photos. And I think they look really good. I mean, they hired a lot of really, they're all professional photographers, newspaper photographers, book photographers, and so on. But, you do not need permission to take a picture of a place. Like if you're standing on the street, that place is a public. I mean, even if it's a private place, it's visible to you while you're in the public, So, that's something I know also from my work, at a newspaper, even anything that's sort of visible in the public, you can take pictures of. Now, of course, these are all places that are open to the public, so of course they probably like to have their picture taken, and they have no problem with that being included in somewhere. To go inside, though, of course, to go into that private space, you do need permission. But obviously the museums and the historical societies and stuff, they welcome attention because it helps further their mission as well.
Okay, and people can visit the Mark Twain gravesite?
Yes, you can do that.
As well, okay.
Yeah, the one, I should mention that the one place that's not public is the place, Quarry Hill, outside of Elmira. That is just open. That was Mark Twain's kind of writing retreat. It had been a property of his father-in-law and then his sister-in-law, and that is used today just for, it's like the Center for Mark Twain Studies, so it's used for scholars and researchers and people like that. It's not open for public visitors.
Okay. And
but you do get to see what it looks like in the book because we have pictures.
Right. Okay. And the family plot is in Elmira, New York.
Right.
Okay. And
so,
go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so you can see that. I actually have not seen Mark Twain's grave, but we do have the picture. And his daughter Clara had a monument put up to him, but it's a very modest grave. So his grave is just the same modest grave as the rest of his family has there.
Okay, and we really haven't spoken a whole lot about his Olivia, his wife, and his daughters. That was want to touch on them too. You said the Hartford time was the highlight of his life. How were things in the family afterwards?
Well, he and his family had a lot of tragedy. As I mentioned, he had a son who died as an infant. Livy, they had a very strong marriage, but she was, pretty much an invalid most of her life. It's kind of unclear what was wrong with her. She did travel about and so on, but she often had health problems. His daughter, Jean, had epilepsy, which plagued her whole life, and she ended up dying Christmas Eve one year. She drowned in the tub due to her epilepsy in her 20s. Susie, probably his favorite daughter, he often said, died really tragically. She stayed behind when the rest of the family had gone over to Europe on one of their tours in the 1890s, and she was going to eventually meet up with them, and she got very sick, and she died suddenly in her 20s at home without any of her family being able to come see her. It happened so quickly. So he had lost two daughters at a pretty young age. The only child that he had who outlived him was his daughter Clara, who actually got married kind of like late in life, and she was pregnant when he died, but he never lived to see his grandchild ever, and he really loved children so much. And his wife, Livy,
Okay.
had died in 1904, so she had died 6 years before him.
Okay. And maybe we can kind of segue a little bit from the death theme. His house in New York City is supposedly haunted.
Yes, the one in the West 10th Street, you mean?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, that is supposedly haunted. That's what people say. It had a terrible event happen in that house years later. I remember seeing this on the news as a child. There was a terrible case of child abuse that took place. It kind of became a cause célèbre in America at the time, but it was said to be haunted even before that. I don't know. I haven't obviously been there and experienced anything like that myself, but Mark Twain was, kind of a believer in things like that, so you never know.
Okay. Well, it's just interesting that supposedly the later tenants saw Sam's
Yeah, they
ghost.
saw something there, they said.
Yeah.
They saw some
Interesting.
kind of a figure or something.
Okay. Well, it just kind of ties in with Tuesday's show of maybe that was a residual haunting. But since we're talking about homes, we also need to talk about one of the most prominent homes in Cleveland. It's you're covering that on a annual basis. It's the house used in the movie The Christmas Story that's probably going to be playing 24 hours a day for the next 3 weeks. Can you tell us a little bit about the Christmas Story house, and is the leg lamp still in the window?
Yeah, so one of the biggest tourist destinations in Cleveland all year long, but especially this time of year, has become the Parker family house on West 11th Street, also known as the Christmas Story house, because this is the house that was featured in the 1983 Christmas classic. I won't even say cult classic because I think it's beyond cult status. Christmas classic, A Christmas Story. It's supposed to be Hammond, Indiana, but it was filmed. Exteriors and some interiors were filmed at this house in Cleveland. There was some work done on a soundstage in Canada as well for some of the interiors, as well as some of the school scenes and so on. So this house is just down like a regular residential, working class street in an area called Tremont. And it came up for sale a little more than a decade ago, just people living in there. In 1983, what had happened was the producers of this film, which was directed by Bob Clark, previously best known for Porky's, they were driving around Cleveland, which was going to fill in as Hammond, and they wanted a house that was, looked like it was from the right era because the Christmas Story is set in 1939. They wanted a house that was near a steel mill because there supposedly were steel mills around Gene Shepard's house in Hammond. The movie's based on his memoir. So they found this house, and it's right at the end of a street. It would be a great location for filming because it's sort of like a U-shaped thing where it's at an intersection, actually, crossroads. And they thought this house had the right look. You could see the steel mill in the backyard. It's just what they envisioned. So they, went to the door, actually, and they told the owner, hey, can we film a movie here? And, of course, at the time, nobody knew this movie was going to be as successful as it was. And they were like, yeah, sure. The guys, I think they gave him $20,000, which, in 1983 was more than today. And he got to stay in the really nice hotel in downtown Cleveland called the Hotel Renaissance, or it was called Stouffer's at the time, but a really nice, beautiful 100-year-old hotel. So they filmed it there. Unfortunately, although this was in very cold winter, it was filmed in March of 1983, and it came out in the end of the year 1983. There was no snow in Cleveland then. So they had to have the fire department come and kind of freeze stuff around there to give it that icy look, and they had to use thousands and thousands and thousands of potato flakes. You know, when you make like mashed potatoes from like potato flakes to make it look like snow.
Yeah.
So they filmed, like a lot of the movie here, and there's some great stories about the filming still. For example, there's a bar that dates back to 1906 across the street called the Raleigh Inn. It's still there. Darren McGavin, the man who played the great actor who played the old man in the movie, was said to shut down the bar almost every single night. He loved to go hang out there. They used the top floor of the bar for a lot of the staging for the movie. So anyway, flash forward from 1983 to about 2004, it's still been the same owner in the house, and there was like a death in that family, and the house went up for sale, and this man named Brian Jones from Florida was a huge fan of the movie, and he saw that it was for sale online, and he bought the house with the intention of making it a museum, just on his own. It's not a nonprofit or anything. This guy's poured his money into it. He was previously already selling leg lamps. That shows you what a big fan he is. So he bought the house and he completely restored it inside to how it would have looked how it looks in scenes in the movie, as well as just, rounding it out with 1939-ish period pieces. You can go in the house and there's the box that says Fragile, and there's a leg lamp in the box there. There's also a leg lamp in the window, one of the most popular photographic destinations in Cleveland. The Christmas tree is there with the Red Ryder and the big blue bowling ball. You go upstairs and you can go in the bathroom, and you can, I don't recommend doing this because it probably has tons of germs from other people in it, but you can put some of that Lifebuoy soap in your mouth. Or maybe the soap kills all the other germs, I don't know. You can see Ralphie and Randy's bedroom, and I really like to see that because you don't see their bedrooms too much in the movie. So they've really done a nice job of kind of like fleshing it out with what they imagined like a 1939 boy's bedroom would be, like Wizard of Oz posters and Flash Gordon posters and comic books from the time and everything. So to me, it's a really touching experience because there's this one man who loved the movie had a dream, and it's just kind of like DIY homespun, house that you can go into. The time between Thanksgiving and the end of the year, you pay to go in. It's a fairly low price. I can't remember. I think it's between $10 and $13. You just go in on your own. The rest of the year they do guided tours, but there's just so many people there this time of year they can't do that. I did take a guided tour before Thanksgiving, and it's just so interesting because you learn things. I don't know how familiar people are with the movie, but there's the department store scene where the crazy mean Santa and Elf are was filmed at a very famous Cleveland department store named Higbee's, which you can see the name Higbee's in the movie pretty prominently. It's down on our public square. And that's actually the reason, I learned this on the tour years ago, that's actually the reason the movie came here. It's because Bob Clark and the producers of the movie sent more than 150 letters to department stores nationwide saying, we want to make this movie in February and March, and we want you to leave up all your Christmas decorations and let us film all night in your store. And Higbee's was the only one that got back and said yes. So thanks to Higbee's, we had this production come here. Higbee's did have one caveat. They said they didn't want to be in an R-rated movie because, like I mentioned, Bob Clark had done Porky's before. So they said they didn't want any swearing in it. And so the story goes that that's the reason the father says, and Ralphie say, oh, fudge, and things like that, which I think really adds to the sort of the vintage ambiance of the film, in fact.
Okay, is there a pink bunny costume hanging in the closet?
No, but there's actually on the lot next door, there's about a 20-foot tall pink inflatable Ralphie in his Pink Nightmare costume. And if you go across the street to the gift shop, there's a wall of those things that you can buy. I think they're about $100 if you want that. It's become such a cottage industry in Cleveland, actually. This weekend there's a big 5K and 10K race. You'll see people running 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers wearing those pajamas. And there's a really great bakery called Jack Frost Donuts that creates Pink Nightmare donuts. And I mean, it's a pretty big deal here these days. We've got a stage version of it. We have a musical version of it. There's a Great Lakes Brewing Company does a beer called Triple Dog Dairy. I mean, a candy company does something called Oh Fudge. I mean, it's just, if you come to Cleveland ever, I will take you around and show you all the Christmas story things you can imagine.
Okay, that kind of sounds like a setup for next year. I'll end up being in the bunny marathon costume race.
And you can have some Triple Dog Dairy beer at the end.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, well, Barbara, we'll have to make a road trip to Cleveland next year for get some photos of this.
Well, you can do the race and I'll drink the beer.
Okay.
I'll stay with Barbara and drink the beer and eat the donuts while you run.
Yeah.
We'll get those subscribers up. You have to subscribe to see the photos of me in the doing the race. But okay, we'll talk about that in next year. But so it just sounds like that Northern Ohio area has been really good for the film industry. Mark was a guest with us, a few months ago for the second time covering his publication of his Shawshank Redemption book, and that's right. not all that far from you either, and you've given us some really great behind the scenes look at how the community has remained involved with promoting the legacy of both of those beloved movies.
Yeah. I actually looked up the reviews of A Christmas Story when it first came out the other day, and from 1983, in both the Plain Dealer, where I work, as well as other papers, and they were really not positive reviews. I think the only paper that gave it a good review at the time was the Boston Globe. So it was interesting to see how the people knew something that the critics didn't, but it really touched, I think, something in Cleveland, or not Cleveland, but nationwide. People sort of were pulled in by the kind of innocence and charm and nostalgia of that movie and the humor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Mark brought that up as well. That the Shawshank Redemption really took a while to catch on, and was nominated for Academy Awards, but that kind of came later. But it was TCM actually helped to turn it into the mainstay it is now. A couple years later,
with their marathons.
Mhm. So you have two great movies filmed very near each other. Okay, and so when people are done visiting Higbee's and having O Fudge beer and the Christmas Story house, there you've also covered paranormal places in the Cleveland area as well. I like the little review you did of the Fairpoint Harbor lighthouse. Lighthouses are
haunted by a cat.
Interesting in the first place, but after you get out of the Christmas Story area on, you said 11th Street, how do you get to the Fairpoint Harbor Lighthouse?
That's actually pretty far. That's, I would say, about a 45 minutes drive or so east of Cleveland along the lake.
Okay.
But it's worth a trip up there. It's very beautiful, and I took a tour of it, and I went out there, and I didn't see a ghost cat, but I did see a cat just lurking around. So I wondered if that, meant anything. And I've talked to so many people who've seen that ghostly cat out there that, something to think about. It certainly has so many sightings that makes you think.
Okay, and there's also the Gray's Armory. And,
yeah.
And that was people who listen to Tuesday's show. I was just kind of interested in that subject. Where that was more of a speakeasy, and the late this armory has their lady in white.
Yes.
It seems like maybe she's just kind of stuck in place. That was an interesting aspect from Tuesday's show. Was you understand someone who just kind of just doesn't want to leave a place, and then you get people from distant places that for some reason end up stuck inside a house that it seems like they really have no connection being there. I think that's a fascinating subject. But anyhow, this armory has a couple different periods where ghosts seem to be representing them. Can you tell us a little bit about that in the next over the next 7-8 minutes we have left in the show?
Yeah, so the Armory is one of the oldest still standing buildings in Cleveland, and it was in fact an armory. It looks like a castle. It's a very imposing kind of turreted building, and it's right downtown, really right around the corner from where the Indians and the Cavaliers play. And so it goes actually back to 1837, so well before the Civil War, and it is really said to be haunted by a couple of main ghosts. There's a lady and a man who are said to haunt it. I've talked to there's a retired Cleveland police officer named Chuck Gove who does tours of haunted places in Cleveland, and he said many people on his tours have seen these ghosts there. Sometimes they're by the organ. There's an old classic organ in there. Here are the ladies wandering around, and nobody really knows who they are. I would have thought it would have been haunted maybe from like a Spanish American war soldier or something like that. But there's this mysterious man and woman, one in white, one in green, that are said to just kind of be seen there. It's interesting because I think, because it is such an old building, it's often those old buildings that you hear about that you hear these stories about the most, right? Because they have so much history. The Armory is very close to Cleveland's Playhouse Square, which dates back to 1922. It's the largest performing arts complex outside of New York City, And that's also supposedly very haunted, and that makes sense because of all the theater people, who've been there over the years. But interestingly, they are also supposed to have a ghost in green who shows up there. Maybe it's the same one as from the Armory. I'm not sure.
Okay, and we're winding down the show to about 5 minutes. If people are looking for a great book to get over Christmas, and you have a Mark Twain literature class coming up for the spring semester, get a copy of Mark Twain's America Then and Now. It's available on the Amazon website. Is there any other websites or Facebook pages you want to plug?
Yeah, I mean, if people are in the area, I have a Facebook page called facebook.com/LostCleveland, which I share information about events I'm doing. I'm doing for example, on December 16th at an Irish pub in Cleveland called PJ McIntyre's. I'll be doing a talk about Mark Twain and the book and showing about photos, including ones that are not from the book, just rare photos for about an hour. They can find out about events like that. I also have an Instagram page at Lost Cleveland, in which I just kind of like to show historic photos of Cleveland and Mark Twain and all sorts of things like that. I just really just love to. I just as I know you are, just a big fan of history, and so I just try to share cool historic photos. I found, or just stories I'm working on. Like, for example, I toured an old speakeasy that was uncovered in a building under renovation, not too long ago, and I shared pictures of that, so that kind of thing.
Okay.
And of course, if you're check out your local independent bookstores too. I always like to encourage people to do that.
Okay. Well, Laura, you have a very interesting book. It's a great biography. The photos that you took, or your staff took, are almost from the exact same angles. You learn more, little details like the Boston bookstore that's now at Chipotle.
I know. Gosh, isn't that funny?
Yes, see how things have changed over the last 140 years or so, but it was really a great time learning about Mark Twain, reconstructing his life, and the Christmas story is fun. Stopping there, it's good time of the year to place yourself in a movie, and check out all the other things going on in Cleveland. And Barbara, do you want to get ready to wrap up the show? This is just a terrific evening. Thank you so much, Laura.
Oh, thank you, Mark and Barbara, so much for the invitation. I'm honored to be a guest, and I'm already looking forward to next year in Cleveland. We'll do the Christmas story experience.
Cool. Sounds great. Yeah, we'll have to do the marathon. So, Barbara, you want to step in and wrap up the show? Thank you again. And this is Laura DeMarco, and her book is Mark Twain's America Then and Now.
Great. Thank you so much. Good night.
All right.
Okay.
Good.
Thank you so much, everybody, for being with us tonight. To make sure that you tune in, check out the website. That's at barbaradulong.com. It'll have the most recent show coming up and when and where you and how you can listen to it. And check out the archives on our YouTube channel. That's Barbara DeLong as well. And let us know what you think and give us any suggestions that we might be able to expand our vistas on. Also, if you enjoy it, please do sign up and subscribe to the channel so you can be notified when we do even more interesting and wonderful shows. Thanks so much, everybody, and good night.